You sold your house to help us, Margaret, but that doesn't mean you live here. The words came from Claire Whitmore's mouth so calmly that for a moment the room felt strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether Margaret Whitmore had heard them correctly. Margaret stood near the kitchen island of the brand-new suburban house, her hands still holding the warm apple pie she had baked that morning, the same recipe she had made every Thanksgiving for nearly 40 years. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint and new wood floors, a scent that should have meant beginnings. But instead it felt unfamiliar, almost cold. Daniel Whitmore, her only son, stood beside the window looking out at the backyard, a wide patch of grass surrounded by a white fence that Margaret herself had admired just minutes earlier. He said nothing. Margaret's eyes moved slowly across the open floor plan. The living room blended into the kitchen, sunlight spilling through tall windows, everything modern and bright. She had imagined sitting in a chair by that window with a cup of tea in the mornings when she visited, watching the light fall across the lawn. She had imagined many small things like that during the months leading up to this day. Just 6 months earlier, Margaret had still been living in the large colonial house where she had raised Daniel. After her husband passed away 3 years before, the house had become too quiet, too full of memories that echoed through empty rooms. When Daniel and Claire told her they were struggling to afford a home in the area, Margaret made a decision that felt both practical and generous. She sold the house and moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment downtown, a place barely 800 square feet, small enough that most of her old furniture had to be given away. The money from the sale helped Daniel and Claire secure the down payment for this new house in a peaceful neighborhood 20 miles outside the city. Claire had thanked her more than once during those weeks. She had talked excitedly about how they would design the home, how there would be space for family dinners and holidays, how Margaret would always be welcome. Margaret remembered those conversations clearly now as she placed the pie gently on the counter and looked again at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. She had noticed something earlier while Claire proudly walked her through each room. The guest bedroom had become a home office. The smaller room had been turned into a fitness space with a treadmill and yoga mats. There was a nursery planned for someday, Claire had said with a hopeful smile. But nowhere in the house had Claire mentioned a place for Margaret. Not once. Margaret studied the floor plan brochure, still lying on the kitchen table. Each room had a neat printed label: office, gym, nursery, master bedroom. She waited a moment, giving Daniel time to speak, but he only shifted his weight and avoided her eyes. Claire folded her arms lightly and smiled in a polite way that did not quite reach her eyes. The silence stretched long enough that Margaret finally understood what neither of them had said out loud until now. She had sold her home to help them build theirs, but in Claire's version of the future, Margaret Whitmore was never meant to have a room in it. Margaret Whitmore did not argue. She simply nodded once, the kind of small, polite gesture that had carried her through decades of uncomfortable family moments, church meetings, and neighborhood gatherings where saying less was often wiser than saying more. She slid the apple pie a little closer to the center of the kitchen island and brushed a faint line of flour from her sleeve. Claire was already talking again, her voice light and practical, explaining how the house had limited space and how every room had been carefully planned to fit their future. Daniel remained quiet, staring down at the hardwood floor as if studying the grain of the wood might somehow help him avoid the conversation entirely. Margaret listened, but the words seemed to blur together in her mind. What she heard instead were echoes of conversations from months earlier, long before this house existed, back when everything had still sounded hopeful. The memory returned with surprising clarity. It had been a chilly afternoon in early spring when Daniel and Claire first visited Margaret in the old house. The maple trees in the front yard were just beginning to show green buds, and Margaret had served them coffee at the kitchen table where Daniel had done his homework as a boy. Daniel explained that home prices in the suburbs had risen again. Claire spoke about interest rates, mortgage approvals, and the difficulty of saving enough for a down payment while paying rent in the city. Margaret remembered how Claire had leaned forward with an expression that seemed both worried and hopeful at the same time. Margaret had looked around the kitchen that day, noticing the familiar cabinets, the worn edge of the table, the soft ticking of the wall clock that had hung there for decades. The house felt large now, larger than one person truly needed. After her husband passed away, Entire rooms had gone unused for weeks at a time. Dust gathered in corners that once held birthday parties and family dinners. That afternoon, Margaret made a quiet decision. She told them she had been thinking about downsizing. She said that selling the house could free up enough money to help them buy a place of their own. Daniel had looked stunned at first. Claire had reached across the table and taken Margaret's hand, her voice warm with gratitude as she said they would never forget such generosity. Claire had talked about how wonderful it would be for Margaret to visit often once they had a real home. She had even mentioned a cozy room on the first floor where Margaret could stay whenever she wanted. Margaret remembered smiling at the thought of that small room. She imagined a comfortable chair, a lamp for reading, and maybe a small shelf for the old books she had carried with her through every move of her life. The idea had made the difficult process of selling the old house feel worthwhile. Packing up 30 years of memories had not been easy. Margaret had spent weeks sorting through photographs, dishes, and furniture that no longer fit into the smaller apartment she eventually rented downtown. The apartment was quiet and efficient, just 800 square feet, with a single bedroom and a narrow balcony overlooking a busy street. It was a practical place for a widow living alone, but it was never meant to replace the feeling of family. Margaret had believed that the new house Daniel and Claire were buying would become that place instead. Standing now in the bright kitchen of the home her sacrifice had helped create, Margaret slowly realized how easily promises could disappear once a door closed and a new one opened. Margaret Whitmore remained in the kitchen a few minutes. Longer after Claire finished speaking, her fingers resting lightly against the smooth edge of the marble counter. The house was quiet again, filled only with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside on the street. Claire began opening cabinets and pointing out small design details, explaining where the plates would go and how the pantry shelves had been arranged for efficiency. Her voice carried the tone of someone describing a project that was already finished, a plan that had been carefully settled long before Margaret ever walked through the front door. Daniel moved slowly toward the living room window again, folding his arms while watching the backyard. The fence looked freshly painted. A young maple tree had been planted near the corner of the lawn, its thin branches tied to wooden stakes so it could grow straight. Margaret noticed the detail and wondered briefly how long it would take the tree to grow tall enough to cast shade across the yard. Perhaps 10 years. Perhaps longer. She realized then that Claire was still talking about future plans for the house. There would be a barbecue area on the patio next summer. Eventually, they hoped to install a small garden along the fence. Claire described these ideas with quiet excitement, the kind that suggested she had imagined this future many times already. Margaret listened politely, nodding once or twice, but her attention drifted toward the hallway again. She could still picture the neat labels printed on the floor plan she had seen earlier. Office, gym, nursery, master bedroom. Each space had a purpose. Each space belonged to someone. A small memory surfaced from several weeks before, back when the house was still under construction. Claire had sent Margaret photographs through text messages, showing the progress of the building. The kitchen cabinets had just been installed. The living room windows were being framed. Claire had written cheerful captions beneath each picture, describing how beautiful everything would look when the work was finished. Margaret remembered replying with simple messages of encouragement. She had even mailed them a housewarming gift ahead of time, a set of white dinner plates that she thought would match the bright kitchen. At the time, Claire had thanked her again, saying they could not wait for Margaret to see the finished home. Standing there now, Margaret wondered whether Claire had already decided then that Margaret would only ever be a visitor. She thought about the long evenings she had spent in the small apartment downtown during those months. The apartment building sat on a busy avenue where traffic never completely stopped, even late at night. From the narrow balcony, Margaret could see rows of streetlights stretching down the block. Sometimes she would stand there with a cup of tea, imagining what Daniel and Claire's house might look like once it was finished. She pictured family dinners around a large table, the sound of conversation filling rooms that smelled like home cooking. Those images had helped ease the loneliness that came with leaving the house she once shared with her husband. Now those quiet evenings returned to her mind with a different meaning. Margaret finally picked up her purse from the stool beside the counter and glanced once more down the hallway that held no door with her name behind it. Daniel turned from the window as if he might say something at last, but the words never came. Claire simply smiled again, polite and confident, already comfortable in the home Margaret had helped them build. Margaret Whitmore stepped outside a few minutes later, the late afternoon air cooler than she expected. The quiet suburban street stretched in both directions, lined with similar houses that all seemed new, their driveways still clean and their lawns carefully trimmed. She paused beside the walkway for a moment, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder. Behind her, through the wide living room window, she could see Daniel and Claire moving around inside the house. Claire was still talking, her hands moving as she explained something about furniture placement, while Daniel listened with the same quiet expression he had worn most of the afternoon. Margaret turned toward her car and opened the driver's door slowly. The interior still smelled faintly of the cardboard boxes she had used during her move months earlier. She sat down and rested her hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. For several seconds, she simply looked straight ahead at the quiet street. A memory surfaced again, this time from the day she signed the papers to sell the old house. The real estate office had been bright and formal, filled with neatly stacked folders and the soft clicking of keyboards. The agent had congratulated her on the quick sale, explaining that the market was strong and that the property had attracted several interested buyers. Margaret remembered signing her name on document after document, each page quietly confirming that the house, where she had raised her son, now belonged to someone else. She had told herself then that letting go of the house was part of moving forward. She imagined Daniel and Claire building a life in their new home, a place where family holidays would still gather everyone around the same table. That thought had made the empty apartment downtown feel less lonely. Margaret finally started the engine and pulled away from the curb. As she drove through the neighborhood, she noticed children riding bicycles along the sidewalks and neighbors walking their dogs in the early evening light. It was the kind of peaceful suburb that people often pictured when they talked about starting a family. The drive back to the city took a little more than 30 minutes. Traffic thickened as the streets grew busier, and the quiet houses gradually gave way to apartment buildings and storefronts. Margaret parked in the small lot behind her building and carried her purse upstairs to the third floor. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent from a nearby unit. Inside her apartment, everything was tidy and quiet. The living room held only a small sofa, a reading lamp, and a narrow bookshelf filled with the few volumes she had kept after the move. Margaret placed her purse on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. The apartment felt even smaller now than it had that morning. She walked toward the balcony and opened the sliding door. The city noise drifted upward from the street below, steady and distant. For a long moment Margaret simply stood there looking at the rows of headlights passing beneath the streetlights. Then she returned to the kitchen table and opened the small folder she had brought home from the real estate office months earlier. The documents inside were neatly organized, each page carefully signed and dated. Margaret studied them quietly, her calm expression unchanged, as if she had already begun to see the situation from a much wider perspective than Daniel or Claire ever expected. Margaret Whitmore sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment long after the evening lights of the city had brightened outside the window. The folder of documents remained open in front of her, each page resting neatly beneath the soft yellow glow of the overhead lamp. She turned one sheet carefully and studied the lines again, her eyes moving slowly across the printed text, as if she were reading it for the first time. The numbers, the signatures, the dates, all of it told the quiet story of the decision she had made months earlier. Selling the house had not been rushed. Margaret had always been careful with important choices. Before signing anything, she had visited her attorney, an older man named Robert Callahan who had handled legal matters for her family for nearly 20 years. Robert had known her husband well and had been present during many of the conversations that followed his passing. On the afternoon Margaret first mentioned her idea about helping Daniel and Claire buy a house, Robert had leaned back in his chair and listened carefully while she explained everything. She told him about the rising cost of homes, about the way Daniel and Claire had struggled to find a place large enough for their plans. She explained that selling the old house could give them the opportunity they needed to move forward. Robert had nodded slowly, but he had also asked several thoughtful questions. He wanted to know how Margaret planned to structure the money once the sale was complete. He reminded her that large financial gifts could sometimes create misunderstandings within families. Margaret had listened politely while stirring the small cup of coffee he had offered her. She told him she trusted Daniel completely. After all, she had raised him to be responsible and kind. Claire, she admitted, was still someone she was getting to know, but she believed time would strengthen their relationship. Robert had studied her expression for a long moment before speaking again in a calm, professional voice. He suggested preparing a simple agreement regarding the funds Margaret intended to contribute toward the house. Nothing complicated, he said, just a document that clearly explained the money had been provided as financial support tied to the purchase of property. Margaret had considered the idea carefully before agreeing. She had never intended to create conflict. In fact, she had hoped the paperwork would never need to be mentioned again once Daniel and Claire settled comfortably into their new life. Still, Robert insisted that careful planning was not a sign of distrust, but simply a way of protecting everyone involved. Margaret had signed the agreement that same afternoon, placing the documents in the folder that now rested quietly on her kitchen table. The city traffic continued to hum outside the apartment building as she turned another page and looked again at the signature line where Daniel had written his name months earlier during a quick meeting arranged by Robert's office. At the time, Daniel had treated the paperwork as little more than a formality, something his mother's attorney required before releasing the funds for the down payment. Margaret closed the folder slowly and rested her hands on top of it. Her expression remained calm and thoughtful, but there was now a certain clarity in her eyes, the quiet certainty of someone who had taken the time to think several steps ahead while others were still focused only on the present. Margaret Whitmore slept well that night, something that surprised even her. The apartment was quiet as usual, the distant sounds of traffic fading into a steady background hum that she had grown accustomed to over the past several months. In the morning, she followed the same routine she had built since moving there. She brewed coffee in the small machine beside the sink, toasted a slice of bread, and sat at the narrow kitchen table while sunlight slowly filled the room through the balcony door. The folder of documents remained exactly where she had left it the night before, resting neatly near the center of the table. Margaret did not open it again. She did not need to. Instead, she finished her coffee, washed the cup, and prepared for the day as calmly as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Around mid-morning, she made a short phone call. Her voice was steady and polite, the same composed tone she had used for decades while handling school meetings, insurance paperwork, and the many small responsibilities that came with raising a family and managing a household. On the other end of the line, Robert Callahan listened carefully while Margaret explained that Daniel and Claire had officially moved into their new home. Robert asked only a few brief questions. His voice carried the quiet understanding of someone who had practiced law long enough to recognize when a client had reached a clear decision. Margaret told him she would like to arrange a meeting the following week. Nothing urgent, she said, but she wanted to review the agreement they had prepared earlier in the year and confirm that everything remained properly documented. Robert assured her that the file was already organized in his office. He offered a time for Tuesday afternoon, and Margaret agreed without hesitation. After the call ended, she stepped onto the small balcony and looked down at the busy street below. Delivery trucks moved slowly along the curb, while pedestrians crossed the intersection with cups of coffee in their hands. The city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in Margaret's thinking. Later that afternoon, Daniel called her. His voice sounded careful, almost uncertain, as if he had spent several hours considering what he should say. He asked whether she had made it home safely the day before. Margaret answered calmly, telling him the drive had been easy and that she hoped they were settling comfortably into the house. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. He mentioned that Claire might have sounded direct during their conversation about the rooms, but he explained that she had simply been focused on organizing the house for their future. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, she replied in the same gentle voice she had used when he was a child explaining a mistake at school. She told him she understood that every couple needed space to build their own life. Her words sounded reasonable, even supportive. Daniel seemed relieved by her reaction. The conversation ended politely, with Daniel promising that they would invite her over for dinner once they finished unpacking. Margaret set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood quietly for a moment. Then she looked toward the small folder resting on the table once more. Her expression did not change, but a quiet certainty settled in her mind. the kind that forms slowly when someone begins to see the full shape of a situation that others have only glanced at briefly. Tuesday afternoon arrived with clear skies and mild autumn air, the kind of calm day that made the city look softer than usual. Margaret Whitmore arrived at Robert Callahan's office 10 minutes early, just as she had done for nearly every appointment in her adult life. The law office occupied the second floor of a brick building that overlooked a quiet courthouse square, a place where tall oak trees lined the sidewalks and benches sat beneath their shade. Margaret stepped inside the reception area and greeted the young assistant at the front desk before taking a seat near the window. The room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, a familiar scent that reminded her of the many times she and her late husband had visited the office over the years. When Robert appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, he welcomed her with the same calm professionalism he always carried. They sat across from each other at a wide desk covered with neatly arranged folders. Robert opened a file and adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the documents that had been prepared months earlier. Margaret watched quietly while he turned each page, the soft sound of paper shifting across the desk breaking the silence of the room. Finally, he looked up and spoke in a measured voice. He explained that the agreement Daniel had signed clearly stated that the funds Margaret provided for the home purchase were structured as financial support tied to the property itself. The language was simple but precise. If the money were not returned within a reasonable period of time, the agreement allowed Margaret to claim a proportionate interest connected to the value of the home. Robert emphasized that the document had been drafted in a way that protected Margaret without immediately creating conflict. In other words, it gave her options. Margaret listened carefully, her expression calm and thoughtful. She did not appear angry or upset. Instead, she asked a few practical questions about how the agreement might work in different situations. Robert answered each one patiently, outlining the steps that could be taken if circumstances ever required it. When the conversation finished, Margaret closed the folder and thanked him for explaining everything so clearly. Outside the office, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse square as Margaret walked slowly back toward her car. She noticed people passing by with briefcases and grocery bags, moving through their routines without paying attention to the quiet decisions unfolding around them. Later that evening, Daniel called again. This time his voice sounded more relaxed, almost cheerful. He explained that he and Claire had finally finished unpacking most of the boxes and were beginning to enjoy the new house. He mentioned plans for painting the nursery and adding shelves to the home office. Margaret listened patiently, offering small words of encouragement when appropriate. Daniel spoke about the future as if everything had settled exactly the way he and Claire wanted. When the conversation ended, Margaret placed the phone gently on the table beside her chair. For several seconds, she sat without moving, the quiet apartment surrounding her once again. Then she reached for the folder Robert had returned to her earlier that afternoon and placed it neatly inside a drawer beside the kitchen table. She closed the drawer slowly and turned off the lamp, leaving the room in soft evening light. Already aware that the situation Daniel and Claire believed was finished had only just begun to unfold. Several days passed quietly after Margaret Whitmore placed the folder inside the drawer beside her kitchen table. Life in the small apartment continued with its steady routine. Each morning she watered the two small plants on her balcony, brewed coffee, and watched the city begin another day beneath the soft glow of sunrise. Nothing about her routine suggested that anything unusual was unfolding. Meanwhile, Daniel and Claire were busy settling into their new house in the suburbs. Daniel occasionally sent short messages describing the progress of their projects. One afternoon, he mentioned that the nursery room was nearly ready, even though there was not yet a child on the way. Claire had apparently decided that preparing early would make the house feel more complete. Margaret read the message with quiet interest and replied with a polite note wishing them happiness in their new home. She did not mention the hallway with no door meant for her. A week later, Daniel called again, sounding excited. He explained that they were planning a small gathering for friends to celebrate the house. Nothing large, just a casual evening with food and conversation. Claire had been decorating the living room and arranging furniture so the space would feel welcoming. Daniel said they hoped Margaret might stop by as well, perhaps bringing one of her homemade desserts that everyone always enjoyed. Margaret listened carefully, her tone warm and calm as she answered. She said she would be happy to visit. After the call ended, she stood by the window for several moments, watching the steady stream of cars moving through the intersection below. The invitation did not surprise her. In many ways it felt like a natural next step. Daniel wanted his new home to feel like a place where family gathered, even if the details of that family had quietly changed. Later that evening, Margaret opened the drawer beside the table and removed the folder once more. She reviewed the agreement slowly, her eyes moving across the same pages Robert had explained earlier that week. The language remained clear and straightforward. Daniel's signature sat firmly at the bottom of the page, written months earlier during that brief meeting in the attorney's office. At the time, Daniel had treated the document as nothing more than routine paperwork. Margaret closed the folder again and placed it inside her purse. 2 days later, she returned to Robert Callahan's office for a short follow-up appointment. The conversation between them was calm and practical. Robert explained how simple it would be to send a formal notice acknowledging the agreement connected to the house purchase. It would not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, it would simply confirm the financial arrangement that had already been signed and recorded. Margaret listened thoughtfully and then nodded once. She told Robert she believed it was time to make sure everything remained properly understood. That evening, she drove home through the fading light of sunset. The city streets glowed with the warm reflection of traffic signals and storefront windows. Margaret parked behind her building and stepped out of the car with the same quiet composure she had carried for weeks. Inside her apartment, she placed her purse on the table and looked around the small living room that had become her new normal. Somewhere across the city, Daniel and Claire were preparing their house for celebration, confident that the future they imagined had already been secured. Margaret Whitmore knew something they did not yet realize. Some agreements remained silent for a long time before finally being heard. The evening of the house gathering arrived with soft golden light spreading across the quiet suburban street. Cars slowly filled the driveway and lined the curb as friends stepped out carrying small gifts and bottles of wine, their voices drifting through the warm air. Inside the house, Claire Whitmore moved confidently between the kitchen and the living room, greeting guests and pointing out the details she had spent weeks arranging. The wide windows reflected the glow of the setting sun while laughter and conversation filled the open space. Daniel Whitmore stood near the patio doors speaking with a coworker, occasionally glancing around the house with the quiet pride of someone who believed he had finally reached an important milestone. Everything looked exactly the way Claire had planned it. Every room had a purpose. Every corner reflected the life they imagined building there. A little later, Margaret Whitmore arrived. She stepped out of her car slowly and walked up the path toward the front door, carrying a simple glass dish covered with foil. Inside was a peach cobbler she had baked that afternoon, the sweet scent still warm beneath the lid. When Claire opened the door, she greeted Margaret with a polite smile, the same smooth expression she used for every guest. Daniel quickly came forward to hug his mother, thanking her for coming and guiding her into the living room where several people were already seated with drinks in their hands. Margaret moved through the house calmly, greeting the guests Daniel introduced to her and placing the cobbler on the kitchen counter beside other dishes. The evening unfolded easily. Music played softly from a speaker near the dining table, while people admired the bright kitchen and the wide backyard beyond the windows. At one point, Claire began leading a small group down the hallway to show them the rooms she had decorated. The home office received several compliments. The small gym space made people laugh with friendly jokes about future workout plans. Margaret watched quietly from the living room as the group returned, their voices cheerful. Later, as the conversation softened and guests began collecting their coats, Daniel walked Margaret toward the front door. The air outside had cooled, and the streetlights were beginning to glow along the sidewalk. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a sealed envelope. Her voice remained gentle as she handed it to Daniel. She explained that it was simply a formal notice connected to the agreement he had signed months earlier regarding the money used to help purchase the house. Daniel looked confused at first, turning the envelope over in his hands as if trying to understand why it mattered. Margaret spoke calmly, explaining that the document did not demand anything immediately. It only confirmed that the financial support tied to the house was officially recorded and that one day the value connected to it would return to her, either through repayment or through a share of the property itself. Daniel stood silent beneath the porch light while reading the first page. Through the window behind him, Claire watched the exchange, her confident smile slowly fading as she realized the meaning of the papers Daniel now held. Margaret adjusted her coat and stepped down from the porch with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every moment of the evening. She walked back to her car and started the engine while the house behind her glowed with warm light and fading conversation. Daniel and Claire had built their future inside those walls, but for the first time they were beginning to understand that the foundation beneath it had never belonged entirely to them.